Welcome back to Close-Up. Republicans appear to have favorable political winds at their back in this midterm election, but win or lose, they have a lot to figure out in terms of the direction of the party and just what kind of conservative will be leading the GOP in the future. Someone who has made clear he's going to be part of that conversation is former New Jersey Governor Christie, who's coming to New Hampshire Monday morning to speak at Politics and Eggs, and he joins us on Close-Up.
Adam, good to be here.
Thanks for joining us, Governor. So you've been mixing it up lately with Democrats on the energy issue and very critical of the Biden administration's unwillingness to go all in on North American fossil fuel production. This is a fight with very clearly defined policy differences, which we like, but so many of these petrostates like Russia are not aligned with our interests. Isn't the most strategic move to transition away from fossil fuels as rapidly as possible to starve those oil autocrats of their cash?
Well, Adam, you can have an all-in strategy, and that's what I'm for. We should continue to develop electric vehicles, continue to develop solar and wind power. I think we should spend more money on nuclear as well, but we're not going to be able to do it tomorrow. And people are paying $4 and $5 a gallon at the gas pump right now. They're still paying to heat their homes here as we near the end of winter, and soon they're going to be paying to cool their homes in the summer. Think about this, Adam. We import, prior to the ban, about 600,000 barrels of oil a day from Russia. Because of the Biden administration policies, they've reduced the amount of oil that we produce just in the state of North Dakota by 500,000 barrels a day. That makes no sense. I'd much rather rely upon the governor of North Dakota, Doug Burgum, for our energy than I would on Vladimir Putin.
You mentioned Vladimir Putin. You know, every party wants what they call a big tent. But right now there are some real fault lines under that GOP tent that are being held together by just common distaste for the left. Zeroing in on the #1 international issue right now, should the Republican Party be welcoming to those who have in the past made excuses for or defended Vladimir Putin?
Look, I've never thought that there's been any place in the Republican Party for people who flatter Vladimir Putin. I mean, the fact is the guy is a KGB thug. He always has been. President Bush 43, who I have great admiration for, made a mistake in saying he looked into his eyes and saw his soul. Vladimir Putin was the beneficiary of a mistake by Barack Obama to say that he wanted to reset policy with Russia. Donald Trump was enormously flattering of Vladimir Putin. Even when they invaded Ukraine, he said it was very savvy and genius to have done so. Mike Pompeo said the same thing. That's just not acceptable. We don't want people who are autocrats and dictators being complimented by American officials who perform this democracy. I mean, here's the bottom line. Vladimir Putin is a guy who would eliminate the United States if he had the capability tomorrow. He wants an autocratic world. We cannot be complimenting him because what he does is he plays those compliments on Russian television to counteract all of the criticism he's getting around the world.
You know, a lot of Republicans are afraid to call out former President Trump, and for good reason. It usually doesn't work out well for them politically. You mentioned your comments or his comments there, and you took to Twitter recently to call out him saying that it was a genius move or very savvy to invade Ukraine. But, his words are out there, but do you think the Republican base will do anything other than back him up as they have for the last 6 years?
Well, look, I think absolutely, Adam, as we move forward here, there's going to be a real critical analysis of how the Republican Party can win going forward. And it's about looking into the future, talking about lowering inflation, lowering energy costs, making everything more affordable around the kitchen table for American families. And whoever is going to best articulate that will be the one who leads the Republican Party. And I don't think there's any determination of that at this point, and I don't think there will be until at least till after the First of the Nation primary in New Hampshire in 2024.
So if Trump gets to refer to a brutal and unprovoked invasion as genius or very savvy, and he's elected president again in 2025, what's the implication for the international order? How are his words not going to be read as carte blanche for every expansionist dictator out there?
Well, I think that's the concern, right? And it's not just his words. As we've spoken about, there have been others who have done the same, whether you're talking about Marjorie Taylor Greene or some of the other people who I think are on the fringe of our party. And so we as Republicans, the leaders of our party, have to make very clear that the kind of brutal butchery that's going on by Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, killing women and children, innocent civilians, and trying to take away the freedom of the people in Ukraine to run their country as they see fit, is never going to be acceptable to an American administration. And I have to say this: it's been wonderful to watch NATO come together with sanctions and with clear rhetoric against Vladimir Putin. And I think that's going to make a difference in the long run, as long as Joe Biden goes back to the policy of really aggressively arming the Ukrainians so they can take on the Russians.
You're a former U.S. attorney. We'll have you put on your legal analysis hat here. Even if Trump could be indicted in connection with the January 6th attack, or for the phone calls to Georgia to find the votes, or for the destruction and removal of public documents on his way out of the White House, does the DOJ look at the idea of putting Trump on trial and say, we are not walking into that trap?
Well, look, what I tell you is, during my 7 years as U.S. Attorney in New Jersey, we brought 130 cases against political figures in our state, and we were 130-0. And the reason we were, Adam, was because we only took cases that we knew we could prove well beyond a reasonable doubt. When you're dealing with public figures like that, the office has to make very sure that they're going to do it. If that's true about any political figure in the state of New Jersey, it is triply true about a former president of the United States. So I don't know all the facts that DOJ is looking at. That's one of the ways this works. We don't know everything they know. I know that from my time as U.S. Attorney, but I would say this: people need to be very, very careful about bringing a prosecution against a former president unless they have absolutely rock solid, between the eyes evidence to bring a conviction.
You ran for president before in 2016, so you know what's involved in the process. You're very familiar with New Hampshire. Where do things stand for you right now in terms of a possible run in 2024?
Well, look, I'm absolutely considering the possibility, Adam, and I'm going to continue to work this year in doing the two major things I'm doing politically, which is one, being the co-chair of fundraising for the Republican Governors Association. Arizona Governor Doug Ducey, who's the chairman this year, asked me to come back and help lead the fundraising for the Republican governors, having run the RGA in 2014 and got us up to 32 Republican governors. I know how important that fundraising is, and I'm excited to help my fellow governors across this country to do that. Secondly, I'm co-chairing with Mike Pompeo the Republican Redistricting Trust, where we're helping states throughout the country on the Republican side to try to make sure we get fair maps in congressional redistricting. And so I'll continue to do that. And when we get to the end of 2022, I'll be in a position to make a decision about running for president. Yeah,
you have some national publications trying to set this up as a Christie versus Trump showdown. Would you want to take him on directly?
Look, I will. If I decide to run for president, Adam, I will take on whoever is in the race, whether it's former President Trump or anybody else, because if I believe I'm the right person to be president of the United States, then it's my job to go out there and make the case for myself and against anybody else who's in the race.
Loyalty to Trump is a key issue in the Republican 1st Congressional District primary that we have going on here. Your former aide, Matt Mowers, is running. Another candidate is attacking him as being too close to you and not close enough to Trump. If that kind of attack succeeds, what does that tell you?
Well, it's not going to succeed because, first of all, Matt Mowers was a key player in the Trump campaign in 2016 and a key player in the administration in the State Department as the White House's representative. Matt Mowers is much closer to President Trump and was much more of an integral part of the Trump administration than his opponent. So, with her making these allegations, I don't think they're going to really carry any water. People in New Hampshire know Matt Mowers. They saw what a great race he ran against Congressman Pappas last year. He's going to be the nominee in the 1st Congressional District, and he's going to be the next congressman from there come January of 2023. I am confident of it.
All right, Chris Christie, former governor of New Jersey. We will see you at Politics and Eggs on Monday morning.
Adam, I'm looking forward to it. Looking forward to get back to New Hampshire and see a lot of my old friends there.
All right, thanks for joining us.